A year ago, I approached this with some trepidation. Why? Because I had been told that this power that states have to convene a convention for proposing amendments was one that could explode the Constitution. And I was told that by people I respected. And I saw long lists of scholars that said the same thing. Many of the scholars I respected. But there was something about it that bothered me. How can we be constitutionalists, cherishing so much about the Constitution, and then hit this road bump and look at Article 5 like it's some disaster waiting there to lure us into destroying our Constitution? It didn't make sense. There had to be a deeper purpose to it. And what sparked me to begin my own investigation was what happened when TARP was passed. You had well over 70% of the American people. It didn't matter what party you were from. It didn't matter what part of the country you were from. Everybody rose up and said no. Not once, but twice. And what happened? To no political gain. There was nothing to gain from this politically. Washington ignored the voices of the people, gave the power to engage in a $700 billion slush fund to an unelected bureaucrat in the executive branch. And it became apparent to me that there was something fundamentally wrong with Washington. It wasn't that the political process was not working. It was deeper than that. It was that there was a bubble, essentially, around the folks who went to Washington, to whom it didn't even matter that their political lives were in jeopardy for that vote. And it struck me that the reason for this was there was no counterbalance of power. There was nothing but Washington, D.C. in our nation at that time. It's the only game in town. But it didn't have to always be that way. It wasn't always that way. Some of you are aware that there was a thing called the 17th Amendment that took the states out of the U.S. Senate and eliminated the counterbalance of the states once provided in Washington, D.C. And so I started looking for an alternative. We don't have that power anymore, but where can we find the counterbalance that no longer exists? I believe that's what Article 5 is. Now, just before we get into this, Article 5 is the power that 2/3 of state legislatures have to apply to Congress, for Congress to call a convention for proposing amendments. The people who would attend that convention would be representatives of the states. How do we know that? Because this is a process that the founders established to be parallel to and separate from the congressional constitutional amendment process. The convention would be convened by Congress, but it would be populated by the state representatives, known as delegates. Whatever it proposed as amendments, if it proposed any, would have to then be sent out for ratification to the states. It would take 3/4 of the states, 38 states, either through the legislatures or through state-based ratification conventions, to turn those proposals into constitutional law. So the thing to understand about this process is that there are many checks built into it. 2/3 of state legislatures have to apply for it. Congress has to call it. The convention has to be populated with state representatives. Something actually has to get proposed. Congress has to refer it out for ratification. It has to jump through 38 states to become constitutional law. That is a complicated process. And that was the first thing that set off a light bulb in my mind. This can't be all that easy to run away. This is something that is very carefully constructed to have plenty of checks and balances.